We're good? All right, so we're going to go forward and back. Better or worse? 1 or 2? All right. No one gets it unless you have glasses. All right, so I'm gonna try not to pass out or anything. I have some fun chest thing going on, and I'm on a couple muscle relaxers, so I'm on a lot of drugs right now. Prescription, of course. Legal prescription, of course. Yep, exactly. Anyway, without further ado, this is 4140 ways your alarm system can fail. For those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you, I'm Babak Javadi. I'm a hardware hacker and professional warranty voider. I made that title up, but I like it. I'm also a security researcher and pen tester. I started a consulting firm called the Core Group. I'm also involved with another organization you guys may be aware of, the Open Organization of Lockpickers, which I serve as the president on the board of. My research partner, who unfortunately could not make it due to an emergency work obligation, Keith Howell, he was an electronics engineer in the British Army for 10 years. He worked as a network engineer and security engineer for UUNet, for those of you who remember UUNet. Worked for quite some time as a professional locksmith and access control system specialist, and today works as a security consultant for Assurance Data. So without further ado, this talk is basically going to give you guys a pretty basic overview of how a modern commercial alarm system works. I'm going to give you an idea of the basic architecture, some of the weak points, and some of the exploits that we've found that we were able to execute as a result of the weaknesses that we found. It's not going to be 100% comprehensive because it's impossible to do that in an hour's time. This represents 8 months of research from Keith and I, and we're just going to give you some of the really interesting high-level stuff that we found here. So first we're going to do a systems overview. I'm going to talk about Honeywell Ademco systems. Honeywell Ademco systems are, the hardware is pretty old, architecturally speaking, but it's still been in use, more or less unchanged for the past 15 to 20 years under different brand names. It's resold under about 20 to 30 different names worldwide. It represents a market penetration of anywhere between 75 and 90% worldwide. And it's really quite amazing how many different names you see these systems under. Does anyone here use or have seen used ADT? Okay, that's all Honeywell. First Alert, Guardian, any of that, that's all Honeywell. There's a good chance that if you have a security system, it's probably a Honeywell-based system. And they're all pretty much based around the same core concept. So you have your alarm panel, you have keypads that connect to it, you have motion sensors, magnetic contact sensors for doors, etc. You have a sounding device of some kind, an alarm, a strobe, whatever that comes out. Sometimes you also have a wireless transceiver. That's what this guy here is. That's what that guy there is. A lot of systems today use wireless transceivers, and I'll talk about why in a second. And then also wireless sensors when appropriate. So let's go over the client side. Normally, you have all that stuff in your house, and then that's obviously connected to the central office in some way. The remote side has that alarm system connected to the central office via a plain old copper line over the telephone. So when they install an alarm line or anything like that, it's just actually a regular phone line. And your system uses a very fancy 2400 baud internal modem to dial out to make that call whenever there's a problem or anything like that. This little device that you see on the right there, that's the Ademco Communications Interface Adapter Model 2400. It's basically a Hayes 2400 modem that they sell for $200. And it's also the only modem that this works with. So I had to pay $200 for a 2400 baud modem in 2012 to do this research. But moving on, systems details. So the most critical parts of the system talk to each other over something called the Expanded Console Protocol Bus, or the ECP bus. This is the bus that connects the keypads to the alarm system, and also the RF transceiver to the alarm system. It is a proprietary protocol created by Ademco. It is patented. It's a 4-conductor multi-drop bus, meaning it provides both power and kind of sort of serial data. So you have ground, you have plus 12 volts DC, you have data in, you have data out. And I say kind of sort of serial because the best way I can put it is inspired by RS-232. Kind of like when you see fake perfumes, and it's like, inspired by Hugo or whatever. Well, this protocol was inspired by RS-232. There's a lot of protocol violations in there that make it very difficult to work with if you're not familiar with what they've done to basically fuck up the protocol. It's highly sensitive to timing issues. As I mentioned, it contains protocol violations. It's stupid annoying to work with. And it's been fairly well documented by now by people who have reverse engineered it. There's an issue, if you're curious about it, grab a copy of Circuit Seller, issue number 201. There's a great article in there about it. We're not going to go into more details than that about the bus here. Also related to the ECP bus, which will become relevant later in the talk, a fine gentleman named Sean Matthews created a device called the AD2USB, which stands for Ademco to USB adapter. He did his own reverse engineering work on the ECP bus, and he created some neat little hardware that's powered by a PIC microcontroller, and basically allows you to connect your computer to the alarm system directly and talk to it over a real serial bus. It's very, very handy. It provides a clean serial interface directly to the ECP bus in a way that is human readable and usable, so you can make neat little programs for it. And in fact, he also included his own neat little program for it. If you buy this little device, which is like 50, 60 bucks, you can get a free copy of the AD2 USB GUI software, which is basically a pin pad for your Windows, Linux, or OS X machine. And it's very cool. You can do lots of cool stuff from it. And we were able to get a debug version of the firmware that lets us do some other things, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But it's also relevant to this talk. So if you want to learn more information about it, talk to me later. That's the ECP bus. Next, we have hardwired zones. Hardwired zones are the things that, it's a silly phrasing. Any loop that a motion sensor or magnetic contact sensor connects to, or if you have a beam brake or pressure pad or anything like that, these all connect to a number of hardwired zones. And the name is exactly what it implies. So these are devices that are physically connected to the alarm panel. And they represent a variety of different devices. They're used for smoke detectors, tamper switches, motion sensors. There's glass break sensors that are really cool because they actually are tuned for the specific frequency and shape of the waveform that glass makes when it breaks. So normal bumps aren't supposed to set it off, but if the glass actually cracks, it can discern and discriminate between that. And it says, hey, someone's broken some glass, I should set off an alarm. There's also, as I mentioned, photoelectric beam brake sensors, which is just a fancy way of saying freaking laser beams. And also pressure pads. So you can actually buy these little pressure pads that you can hide underneath your carpet. So if someone walks over a threshold that weighs more than 20 pounds, then it'll set off an alarm as well. So these are all things that connect via hardwired zones. Loop operation is pretty straightforward. It's a current sensing loop. So once the system goes armed, it detects the amount of current flowing through that loop. And if the amount of current changes up or down, then it triggers an alarm condition. There are two different types of sensors, normally open and normally closed. There are supervised and unsupervised loops. A supervised loop closely monitors the amount of current going through the loop. So if anyone tries to tamper with it by shorting out a sensor and bypassing a contact, it can detect the change in current and trigger an alarm condition. In an unsupervised loop, there is no end-of-line resistor, so it's either just completely open or completely closed. So those are easier to tamper with. Let's see. I have a note in there, electrical engineers beware. I found through our research that a lot of the terminology that they use in alarm systems, they just kind of made up their own definitions for. So normally open and normally closed in the alarm world is kind of the opposite of normally open and normally closed in the electrical engineering world. So if you are a double E and you get into this stuff, or you're listening to me talk about this, and it seems backwards because it is backwards, and they wanted it to be that way. So moving on. Wireless zones, and I'm going pretty quick because this is a lot of content. I want to make sure we cover it all. Wireless zones are pretty popular these days. These were kind of added on in recent years. They just kind of bolted it onto the old framework to make it work. And what it consists of is an RF transceiver, which connects to the rest of the system via the ECP bus. And it can receive a variety of different signals. Now, the purpose of the RF zones is to make things cheap and convenient. So, for example, if you are a new homeowner or if you have a new business and you're like, hey, I want an alarm system, but I don't want to pay all that money because I don't really care that much about my stuff, can you do it cheaper? They go, of course we can do it cheaper. I can put in all these wireless sensors. We don't even have to run any wires, and we'll get your alarm system lickety-split, 1 hour or less. Awesome. Not so awesome, as you'll see in a moment. All of these sensors, they run on unencrypted 345 megahertz Manchester encoded bit stream, which we've found very easy to listen to and spoof and all that, but we'll get into that too. So each wireless zone, each device, whether it's a remote or a door sensor or anything like that, each one of these devices has 3 key pieces of data that are transmitted every single time that device transmits. There's the device serial number, the loop status, which I will explain what a loop is here shortly. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It didn't to me either, and the only reason I can say that word and look like I know what I'm talking about is because I'm just pretending to, and I still don't understand why they call it a loop. But each device can have up to 4 loops, and that'll make more sense here in a second. And also the status of the device. So the device can have 4 different statuses, waking up from battery power, check-in, low battery, or some unknown state that I'll mention here shortly. There are different kinds of wireless sensors, everything from door sensors to glass break sensors, everything that I mentioned before can almost be had in a wireless sensor. Even wireless keypads. So if you don't feel like wiring up your keypad, you can just stick this on a wall, put some batteries in there, and now you can have a wireless keypad anywhere you want. So now every time you put in your PIN number, you too can send it out over unencrypted 345 megahertz. And a unique serial number per device. The serial number is supposed to be non-changeable. It's similar to a MAC address. Every time you buy a device, on the back side of it, there is a barcode and a human-readable number that represents the serial number of the device. You're supposed to program that into the alarm panel at the time the system is programmed. And that's the only way the alarm system knows what devices it's supposed to listen to. So every time that you transmit on a wireless alarm device, any wireless alarm system in the area is actually receiving that data. It's just choosing to discriminate between devices it recognizes and devices it doesn't. So I'm going to briefly talk about RF data structure. We actually spent a lot of time analyzing the RF side of these alarm systems because that's what was most curious to me. Why commercial alarm systems and residential alarm systems should rely so heavily on such a poorly secured wireless system. We spent a lot of time with logic analyzers hooked up to these various devices, collecting a lot of data, and we ended up reverse engineering more or less what the breakdown of the structure is. So the serial number, which is the first part there on the left, is internally stored as 24 bits. So this is 48 bits that's being sent out every time as a... That would be this wireless sensor here in this bag that just went off. What kind of sensor? It's a door sensor, so it thought the front door was open. Yeah, this is actually a full commercial alarm system that I've set up here, so I'm going to do a couple live demos here in a moment to show you some awesomeness, but we'll leave that armed for now. So anyway, every time a wireless device transmits, it transmits the serial number, which is internally stored as 24 bits. It also transmits the loop status. That's what I was talking about before. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. How well can you see the little diagrams on the lower right-hand side there? Is that readable? Okay. So each device has a number of different buttons on it or a number of different loops on it. And every time one of those is triggered, the alarm system has to know exactly what happened on the wireless side. So for example, on a remote control that has 4 buttons, each one of those 4 buttons represents loops 1 through 4. So for example, if you hit disarm on here, all that's happening is this wireless device is saying, hey, I'm serial number 8952632. My loop status is 2. And when you program the system, you have to tell it that when you hear this serial number, say a loop status 2, do this. That could be the front door is open, sound the alarm, or it could be the disarm button was pressed, disarm the alarm. So all of this is configurable kind of on the fly. You could, if you wanted to, have some sort of crazy silent alarm so that if a door in your house was opened that normally you would never open, then the alarm arms or disarms or something silly like that if you wanted to. But the system doesn't know what kind of device is on the other end. You have to tell it what that device is when you program the alarm system initially. So each device has up to 4 loops. The loops operate independently. The responses, as I mentioned, are custom programmed. Each device also has a 4-bit status code, which is different from your Facebook status. It has low battery, supervisory, meaning if it's a device that checks in once in a while. So for example, the front door sensor, every couple hours it will send out a beacon saying, hey, I'm still here, meaning like I haven't been removed or tampered with, or my battery hasn't died. That's the supervisory bit. There's also wake up or power up, so whenever you put in a fresh battery in a device, the wake up bit is also set. And then there's also a 4th bit. We have no fucking clue what it does. We've analyzed hundreds of different devices. We haven't found a single one that ever sets this bit to 1, but we see it there, it exists. One day we might figure out what it does. For now, we still have no idea. The checksum is 16 bits, and it is a composite of the preceding 32 bits of data. So the checksum's only purpose is to make sure that the data stream hasn't been corrupted or messed with in some way. It is completely static. All of these transmissions are static. It's not rolling code encryption or anything like that. So every time you open a door, or every time a window is opened, or every time you press a button on one of these remotes, the same exact binary stream is transmitted, including the checksum. The checksum does appear to be proprietary. We haven't figured out exactly what method they're using yet. We have been trying to figure it out, including, listing all of the data in an Excel spreadsheet, beautiful mind style, and trying to see if we can figure it out that way. That didn't work so well. But we do have some different people helping us out with that. So if you two are a math whiz of some kind and you think you can crack the checksum code, feel free to contact us. Central office communications. As I mentioned, every one of these alarm systems has a built-in dial-up modem. The purpose of the modem is multi-purpose. It's used for remote programming, so the alarm company can remotely reconfigure your alarm system as you see fit, or maybe as you don't see fit, who knows. It's also for remote monitoring and event logging, so they can log different types of events, how often the alarm is armed, how often it's disarmed, when there's an alarm condition, when your battery goes dead, etc. It also has a feature called remote lockout, where if you decide at some point that, hey, I don't really want to pay for, I don't want to pay $50, $60 a month for you guys to just basically call the police on my behalf, if you decide to cancel your service, what they will usually do is they'll remotely dial into your alarm system, your hardware that you own at this point, and they will just disable it from working. You won't be able to arm it, you won't be able to disarm it, you won't be able to do anything with it. And this is a feature that, as best as I can tell, only really exists just to protect their revenue stream. It has no, in my opinion, no useful purpose for the client other than to basically lock them into a particular carrier. It also is used in conjunction with something called the Compass software. Compass software is the official programming and installation software from Honeywell Ademco. If it interface in there in the thumbnail looks like it was designed for Windows 3.11, it's probably because there was a good chance it was, and it just hasn't been changed since. It is still used today. It is very hard to use. I have tried to use it. It works okay-ish once you get used to it. But like everything else in this system, nothing is very user-friendly. The remote hardware is some sort of Hayes 2400 baud compatible modem, maybe external and maybe modems in a bank, depending on how big the alarm company is. And as I mentioned, it's very silly and expensive. So those are the basic overview components of the alarm hardware. So now I'm just going to touch base on weaknesses. The most common weakness, believe it or not, is programmer or installer error. So when the system is installed by the install technician, it is up to them to follow certain protocols to make sure the system is secure once they leave. One of those things is to remove the default installer code that is programmed into the alarm system from the factory. Each model has a different default code, but there aren't that many default codes out there. In fact, some of them are very, very simple, including 1234, and as you may recognize, 4140. Oftentimes, unfortunately, because installers are sometimes lazy, they will not remove the default installer codes from the system before they leave. So when they come back later, they don't have to worry about the user forgetting their installer code, so they can still make changes to the system. This became such a problem that ADT, at some point in 2010, put out a maintenance notice, and you really can't see it too well up there, unfortunately, but they're basically saying, hey, here's a new policy regarding installer codes. Basically, yes, you are required to change it every single time. You can't leave it as default, and if you do leave it as default, we're not going to let you close out the job. The fact that this had to be a memo as a new policy as recent as 2010 should be quite telling as to how problematic this was becoming. So oftentimes, these installer codes are being left in the system in such a way that anyone could walk up to the panel, log into installer mode, programming mode, add users, remove users, etc.
Can you also arm and disarm with those codes?
No, if you can, if the system is, the question was, can you arm or disarm with those codes? If the system is disarmed, you can arm with an installer code. If the system is armed with a regular code, then you can't disarm with an installer code. And then default ECP addresses. What I mean by that, every device on the ECP bus, whether it's the RF transceiver or a keypad, it has a unique 2-digit ECP address. So the keypad, in order for it to be able to talk to the alarm system, in order for the alarm system to be able to hear it, has to be programmed with an ECP address that has been enabled in the system. On a residential system, only one keypad is enabled by default, which is fine. Most people only have one keypad. On a commercial system, like this one, 2 keypads are enabled by default. But most of the time, 2 keypads are not used. What that means is there's an unused ECP address left enabled in the system, which means that if anyone taps into that line, they have an extra address that is available for use so they can address the system directly and not have to worry about clobbering data from another keypad. And you'll see why in a second. There's also problems that we've noticed with short-sighted architecture. So the system uses some pretty weak pin authentication. There is a fixed pin length. It's 4 characters, no more, no less. You can't have more than 4 characters. You can't use less than 4, and you can only use 0 through 9. So you're basically saying that your alarm system that protects your entire building, all your stuff, has to be protected with 4 numbers that are all 0 through 9, and you can't add any more complexity or entropy beyond that. There's also special functions that we observed such as programming lockout override. So one of the things that the installer is supposed to do before they leave is lock out the programming mode, so that once they leave, then they can only remotely dial in and change settings in the system. It's supposed to be a security feature. So someone, even with an installer code, couldn't come up to a keypad and start mucking with all your settings. They introduced a pretty basic override. If you power cycle the alarm system for the next 30 seconds, the default installer code always works. It's not much different from, saying, okay, if you've forgotten your Windows password, just power cycle your computer, and for the next 30 seconds, you can just type in admin and it'll log in. It's not, in my opinion, one of the smartest features that you can have in this kind of security device. There's also a feature that I'm going to demonstrate in a second called user access level inquiry. So you can imagine in a larger system for commercial alarm systems, if you have 20, 30 different users, because you can protect up to 128 different zones, it might be possible that someone may leave and you might have user codes and you don't know that are enabled in the system, you don't know what their access level is. So of course, you got to know, okay, how do I know, who this user is? What partition do they have access to? Are they a master user? Are they a regular user, et cetera? So they built in a feature for you to ask the system to interrogate it. Hey, pin number 4265. What's their access level? You would think that, on a regular computer you can do this too. You log in as an admin, you pull up the administration console, you pull up a user, tells you if it's enabled, tells you what their access level is. Remember that on an alarm panel, you only have this little keypad to interface with, so you don't have a full keyboard or anything like that. So what they did is they introduced a feature where if you type in any 4-digit code and hit ***, it will tell you if it is a valid user, and it'll tell you what his access level is. And if it's an invalid user, it just doesn't do anything. We found that you don't have to authenticate to the system with a valid number before you use this feature, which means that you can walk up to any commercial Honeywell-based alarm system and just start brute forcing it by hand. We also found that the system allows you to do this even while the system is armed. So if you can walk up to, think about that for a second. You can walk up to an armed system and just start guessing numbers, and it'll tell you if you've guessed correctly without any repercussions.
Unless that keypad is within a control.
That's correct. But as you'll see, we've developed ways to get around that as well. So the system has minimal attack resistance. There's crude RF jam detection, and there's no attack resistance on the wired ECP bus, meaning that there's no brute force detection. There's no command lockout. It doesn't understand that if someone is putting in like a couple thousand keystrokes within a few hours, that's not a normal condition, and it should lock you out. It just allows that to happen. The ECP bus shortcomings, as I mentioned, the ECP bus has not been hardened to attack. It's all unencrypted. It's all shared copper, meaning all of these devices that are connected to the ECP bus, they're all connected to the same 4 terminals. So any command that is sent to or from one device is heard throughout the entire wire. So if you tap into the wire anywhere along the system, you can listen in on all the commands as they're going out over the wire, and you can interface directly with the system. So this allows eavesdropping. It allows interception of keystrokes. Remember that oftentimes tamper switches are not installed on these keypads. So you can, if you wanted to, install a small eavesdropping device inside a keypad while a system is disarmed, close it up, walk away, and then just come back and either pick up the device or have the device send those bits to you wirelessly, and now you're eavesdropped on the alarm pin codes. So there's no hardening. The panel doesn't discriminate between command sources. What I mean by that is that even though this keypad here is ECP address 1 and this keypad here is ECP address 2, if the pin number is 1, 2, 3, 4, I can do 1, 2, 3, 4 splitting the command between two different keypads, and the system will still accept it as a valid command. Which is dumb, because the system knows which keypad those commands are coming from. They just chose not to discriminate. This not only causes a security problem, but also causes potentially major usability issues in large systems. Because if you have one panel controlling 128 different hardwired zones, potentially 10, 15 different keypads, that means that if there's more than two users using keypads at any given time, they're clobbering each other. The system won't be able to understand what command is supposed to be executed. As I mentioned, no brute force detection or command lockout. And of course, because there's no brute force detection, this allows automated or scripted attacks. So before we get to the automated or scripted attacks, I'm just going to show you really quick a couple of the things that I talked about live. We're going to see if we can get our webcam working here. Yay. Dave. So we have... So I'm sorry, we have a narrow field of view here. But okay, we're good? Yeah. All right. So this is one of the keypads here. Right now we can see it's armed, maximum, all secure. Makes you feel nice and warm and fuzzy inside. And the first thing I want to show you guys is the inability for it to discern between keypads. So Dave, we're going to use, this right now is protected with a very secure PIN code. It's 1337. We're gonna alternate numbers, okay? So I'm gonna put in 1, and then 3, and then 7 for you, and I'm gonna hit off. And the system just disarmed, even though we did that on 2 different keypads. That's really dumb.
This is the first time you should all applaud.
So right now the system is disarmed. Let's say I walk up to the system and I'm like, oh, I'm going to start brute forcing it. So I'm going to start at a number lower than what I know is a valid number, and I'm just going to start going up. You'll see I can go pretty fast, and the system really doesn't care or throw up any errors. So I got to 1337, hit star star. It said partition 1, user number 2, authentication level 1, which is master level user. So just now, I mean, I was able to go through about 4 or 5 codes in a matter of seconds. You can imagine that if you have access to a system over the course of a couple days or weeks, it's going to be really almost no work for you to find a valid code or all the valid codes in a given system. And in fact, if I arm the system right now, and I'll let it finish arming. So right now it says I may exit. Once it's armed, you'll be able to see that we can execute this command even while the system is armed. So right now we're all secure. And again, if I do 1337 star star, it still gives me the same information on the screen. Which means, I'm going to go back to our lovely presentation here, which means that if you create a device, say you're a pen tester like I am, and you say, hey, that's really cool, I'm going to create a device that taps in to the alarm wire and just kind of automates that attack, then you now basically have a brute forcing device that allows you to run this command automatically against the system. And we do have a video here for you. Give me a sec here. So here is the very first, device. It's basically the 82 USB with modified firmware, with just some taps that we can use to splice into wires without having to cut them apart or anything like that. And let's see if our video loads here. What's that? Yeah, right? It's literally like the Hollywood, hooking up some magic device and brute forcing it type thing. And I apologize, it has to pull out of the cache. We were constrained on setup time, so I didn't have time to preload it. Any questions so far? Yeah? What about the 21p? No, this has all been very slow going because we've had to reverse engineer a lot of this by hand, not by hand, but manually. And this is an ongoing project. Every month that goes by, we have new discoveries that we've made. And this is just current up until today, effectively. So we haven't looked at all things Honeywell yet, but we're getting there. And we're going to look at every aspect of the system, including some other stuff that I'll talk to you about as well. But I haven't looked at the TCP/IP versions yet. But I'm sure they're equally awesome. Yeah. So here is the script that we wrote. You can see that it retrieved the current system status, and it said, hey, the panel is currently armed. Do you want to brute force it anyway? I said, sure, why not? And it is running sped up. That's the current system clock that you see there in the corner. And you can see the current pin number being tried on the left there. And once we get a couple more seconds in, you'll start to see that it'll start picking up pin numbers. And this is something that you can connect and you can leave running overnight. So, if you're on a pen test job and you pop this on there and you just let this script run, in not too much time, you're going to have a lot of pin numbers enumerated, and you can enumerate the entire key space in pretty short order. In fact, based off of our experience, you can enumerate 100% of the key space with the current off-the-shelf hardware in about 8 hours. And with some new versions of the hardware that we're designing, we think we can get that down to 4 hours. And if you think about that, 4 hours for exhausting the entire pin key space of an alarm system is pretty goddamn good. That means you get every single pin code in 4 hours. And you see that note in there that says this feature is only available on commercial alarm systems. That's because this interrogation feature is only enabled on Honeywell's Vista 50p and up commercial systems. Residential systems don't have this capability. Only commercial systems do. And in fact, based off of all of my research, both on the technical Honeywell technicians website and all the manuals, there's no way to turn off this feature. If you have a Honeywell system and it's a commercial system, Vista 50p or up, it has this feature and you can't turn it off. Yes? We have attempted to contact Honeywell regarding some of our findings, and they have failed to respond. Physically remove what? Some keypads have a tamper switch. Most of the time it's not installed. Just like modern HID readers, like RF readers, also have support for tamper switches. Most of the time they're not installed. So proper installation, just like any security system, proper installation is paramount to mitigate your worst weaknesses.
Have you guys come up with a name for this yet, like war pinning?
No, not yet. We're just playing around for now. So. So the device that we're using, the 82 USB, is not an attack device, just to be clear. This is a device for the home user, for the tinkerer, to legitimately connect to their alarm panel and interface with it. And because it's, everything he's done for the ECP bus, he reverse engineered, he's written his own code. It's more than sufficient for acting as a regular keypad. It wasn't designed for speed, for brute forcing an attack. The next device that we're making from scratch will. So, hardwired zone weaknesses. End-of-line resistor placement. I mentioned, if you recall, that every hardwired zone has every supervised zone has an end-of-line resistor. The end-of-line resistor, guess what? Is supposed to go at where? At the end of the fucking line, yeah. What ends up happening is how many of you guys actually have an alarm system in your house? Or in your business? Cool. When you go home, open up your alarm system. Let me switch here. open up your alarm system and look for resistors on the terminals like that. Specifically, look for resistors on terminals that have wires leading out from them. Those are your hardwired zones. If you see, now I don't have any hardwired zones hooked up right now for this demo because I don't have enough space for it. But if you see resistors in the panel instead of at the end of the hardwired loop, what that means is that your installer was a lazy guy, to be nice. It means that if someone shorts out or mucks with your sensor on the sensor side, your supervised loop has no way of knowing that has happened. Whereas if the end-of-line resistor is placed at the end of the line, it makes it much harder for that attack to take place. Not impossible, just more difficult. So this is, you can see, good wiring versus bad wiring. Where is that resistor placed? And it all comes down to the installer, not wanting to spend extra time in doing that. So let's pop back over. Come on. There we go. So end-of-line resistor placement is very important. Wire management, it shouldn't be said that exposed wires are bad, but exposed wires are bad. I don't know how many times you guys have seen door sensors with wiring that you can access from the outside. That's way more common than you might think. Sloppy wiring, anything where the wiring is visible is generally really, really not good. If your installer cares about your installation, they will make every attempt possible to route the wiring through a door, through a conduit, through a frame, anything to make sure that people have a hard time getting to that wiring to muck with it, because you need to slow that attacker down, because that's all you have. If they can get to your wires, you're fucked. And lazy wiring, as I mentioned. Tamper detection is difficult when you have bad wiring or bad resistor placement. RF zone weaknesses, transmitters. There are two kinds of transmitters. Supervised transmitters, such as door sensors, motion sensors, shock, glass, etc. These are unencrypted, low-power, one-way devices. They transmit only once per state change. They transmit a check-in signal every 4 hours. And the panel's default check-in interval is 12 hours. So let me go through what all that means right now. They transmit only once per state change. That means that because these aren't two-way devices, it has no way of knowing that its transmission has been received or not. So when you open a door, it sends out that signal, says, hey, door's been opened. And then it never sends out that signal again. Which means that if you jam that signal for that half a second that you open the door, the alarm system never knows. It never knows, and there's no way to tell that signal was never received. And even if the system is armed, if you jam the signal and you open a door, and then you stop jamming and you close the door, the alarm system isn't smart enough to know, hey, you can't close the same door twice. It just says, okay, fine, whatever. The supervisory signal, to make sure no one has physically removed the device or maybe is jamming it. The check-in signal is sent once every 4 hours, but the panel by default only checks for it once every 12 hours. That means that you can jam, in most situations, you can jam a sensor or a group of sensors for up to 12 hours without the system knowing that those sensors aren't communicating. Think about that for a second. That's a huge deal. I couldn't believe it when I saw that first. Then there's unsupervised RF transmitters and key fobs. These are things like, little key fobs like this. Anything that leaves the house that obviously can't check in every few hours, those are unsupervised devices. And the attack vectors are numerous. Because this is unencrypted 345 megahertz, Manchester encoded, all you need is anything that can listen in on that frequency, and you too can listen in on all the wireless transmitters in the area. In fact, at ShmooCon, when we connected this system and we started listening in to other alarm systems in the area, we found probably about 20 or 30 different sensors just within range of our hotel room that were all transmitting. And we were able to eventually figure out that one of them was a motion sensor, because we could tell how, every so often it would kind of blip that, there was motion being detected. And the reason this is bad, if it's not painfully obvious, is that you are transmitting blindly, you are transmitting information about what's going on inside your building. You're telling people when people are in the building, when people are not in the building. And you're just broadcasting that information. Not only that, it's very simple frequency to jam, and these receivers, the old ones don't have jam detection at all. The new ones have jam detection, which is turned off by default, and when you turn it on, it only checks every 45 seconds for a jam condition. That means that even on a system that has enabled jamming detection, there's only once every 45 seconds that it checks. So you still have a pretty darn good chance that you can still jam a sensor successfully, at least long enough to open the door, close it, etc. And we found the system is completely vulnerable to spoofing. Is anyone familiar with the TI Chronos watch? Okay, well, for those of you who don't know, it's a little development kit with a TI radio in it. You can program in what frequency for it to transmit on. Yeah? It just says that there is RF noise. Like there's the little display says, RF problem, basically. Zone 99 or something. There's a zone number that's specially assigned to it. And the problem is it's off by default because there's a lot of false positives. I turned it on in my house when I was setting this stuff up, and even when I wasn't jamming, it was going off. So I can't imagine many people would actually use it. We've been able to successfully spoof. Is that 15? What is that? 10. Okay, thank you, because you did that multiple times. Thank you. We found that we were able to very easily record these transmissions and play them back. So, for example, if you want to, let's say you don't have any sophisticated jamming equipment, if you just record a signal in a given area for a motion detector or a door, and then you decide to just start playing it back randomly, say from a distance, what's going to happen? You're going to have a zone that's continually triggered over and over again, and what's going to happen when the guard keeps going to the same area and no one is there? What are they going to do to that area? They're going to bypass that area. They're going to bypass the zone because they're not going to keep walking to it every single time. So just by some simple spoofing attacks, you can wreak all sorts of havoc on any alarm system that uses wireless because, again, it's just all completely unencrypted. It all assumes that everyone's going to play nice. But weaknesses in the bidirectional side, so keypads and key fobs. Keypads, there's two kinds of wireless keypads, and I have both of them here. There's the older kind, which is this one on your right. This is an unencrypted keypad. It uses a house ID, which is a 2-digit code, 0 through 31. And the way that works is when you set this up, it will, rather when you set up the alarm panel itself, it asks you to define a house ID. And it has because the house ID is what it will use to determine which keypads belong to it and which keypads belong to other houses in the area. And how do you know what other IDs other houses are using? You don't want to conflict with them. Well, don't worry. They have a really neat feature for that. You can put it into something called promiscuous mode, where it will just sit there and wait, and it'll tell you the number of other house IDs in the area. So you know not to pick that house ID. So once you do that, then you can program that house ID that you have in here, and now your keypad will only talk to your alarm system. So that's the security for this keypad. Newer keypads like this one, this is a slightly nicer one, are technically encrypted. To the best of our knowledge, they appear to be using Microchip's key lock technology, which is a rolling code encryption also used by car manufacturers, garage door openers, etc. It's used a lot of different places, and it was broken in 2007. Yes? Potentially. To the best of my, sometimes, yeah. Your question was, if you connected a wireless keypad using your neighbor's house ID, would you be able to brute force it? The thing is, if they're using a residential system, they won't have that feature, the interrogation feature. Does that make sense? So they would have to be using a commercial system. And let's see here. Well, I'm checking it right now. To be honest, I don't remember if, this isn't a text display keypad. You have to execute that command on a keypad that can display text alphanumeric characters, and this one is a very basic keypad. So the encrypted keypad is actually a 2-line display keypad, and you can do it on that, but you can't do it on that keypad. There's nothing to say that maybe you can't, create your own device possibly that does that, but we've been unable to do that so far. But it does mean that you can potentially listen in to PIN numbers being put in wirelessly, and you don't really have to brute force it then. So yeah, we haven't looked at key lock much further, just because it's kind of complicated, and we haven't gotten that far yet. Panel central office. How does your panel communicate with the central office over the phone line? It's a 2-part authentication scheme. There's the subscriber account number, which is a hex number, 4 bytes. It's supposed to be unique per customer, and a CSID number, which is 8 bytes. It's supposed to be unique per alarm company. And if you have these 2 pieces of information, you can dial into an alarm system and interrogate it, change programming, etc. It's reasonably secure. I mean, the odds that you're going to brute force that are kind of slim, to be honest with you. ADT thought, hey, that's really cool, that's pretty secure. We think that's too secure for us. They decided that they would drop it to single factor and just use a subscriber account number to dial into their panels, with the only caveat being that you have to use their special ADT software. So if you have the special ADT software, that takes care of one factor, and if you know the subscriber's account number, which is printed on any number of different pieces of documentation, either at the central office or on the original subscriber paperwork, then you could potentially dial into those systems as well. We haven't had a whole lot of luck finding lots of ADT hardware or information. They do a pretty good job of hiding their shit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that no one's going to find it. It just means that no one's found it yet. Phone call security, supposedly, it is reported by Honeywell to be encrypted, so you can't just tap into it. But if it is encrypted, that encryption was designed and created about 20 years ago, so that should speak for how good that encryption probably is. We haven't had a chance to take a look at that yet, but as I mentioned, a lot of this is a work in progress. The protocol, algorithm, and security are unknown. It might be good, it might not be. I honestly, genuinely don't know, but we just want to say that. Mitigations, I'll go pretty quick here. What can you do to mitigate these weaknesses as best as you can? Careful and proper installation, as I mentioned. Hide your wires, protect your wires. What's that? Yeah. Yeah. The previous version of this slide actually had hide your kids, hide your wife in there too, but the Argentinian crowd didn't really get it. Don't use RF devices for obvious reasons. Know your weak points. In any system, you're going to have weak points. You're going to have areas that are potentially prone to attack, prone to being vulnerable to people mucking with it. Know about them and plan for them accordingly. Protect your power source. A lot of shitty things can happen if your attacker has the ability to power cycle your alarm. Make sure your backup battery is always good. If your backup battery is 4 or 5 years old, it's not good. Replace it. Make sure that you know how long that backup battery is going to last, so that if someone does pull the power on your house while you're away, that backup battery is going to be able to cover it long enough for the alarm to dial in saying, hey, there's a power loss, or long enough for the power to come back. Physical access to your alarm panel by an adversary is bad, duh. So make sure that it's in a room that is not easily accessible and that is well protected. And finally, caveat. Everything here, as I mentioned, is a work in progress. The scope of the research is restricted so far in that we have limited time and resources. To date, we spent probably about $8,000 to $10,000 on different pieces of alarm hardware just so we can research all the different aspects of it. That's all been out of pocket. We do plan on continuing to expand this into multiple brands and all their systems as well, but the process is somewhat slow going. So this is just restricted to Honeywell Ademco systems, which thankfully covers most of the world and most of the marketplace, but it doesn't necessarily apply to all brands and all models. That's it. I'm sorry I went so fast. I hope it was as interesting for you as it was for me. If you want to contact me, my info is up there. If you want to contact my research partner, his info is on the right. We might have time for one or two questions, maybe. I don't know. Guy in the red cap, do we have time for questions? No? One? Can I have one question? Okay, he says one question. Does anyone have any questions? What's that? No? Not even one? Okay. All right, cool. Then we're good. Thanks very much. Fuck that. Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it.